Hi, folks. How you doing? Well, I'm glad you're here. It's nice not to speak to an empty room. So about me, I'm not going to go aggrandize myself because I'm not worth it, but I just start off and say I'm not Greek. But I have an incredible love of the Greek community. And it probably started with that movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding. We're going to try to locate a bottle of Windex, but I couldn't find it. So, and I'm not Greek, but I do have Telly Savalas' haircut. So there is that going for me. When I am a convert to the Greek Orthodox Church. I've been going to the Orthodox Church for almost 11 years. Was chrismated in the Orthodox Church 10 years ago, and that started my interest in the community. And when I first started, I went to the Greek Festival. Have you ever been to the Greek Festival?
Yes.
All right, you got to go to the Greek Festival. I went and I volunteered one year, and somebody came up to me and said, "What's it like being Greek?" And first I forgot where I was because I have a short memory span. I said, I don't know, I'm not Greek. And they were shocked that I was working at a Greek festival. You don't have to be Greek to be part of the church. But being part of the church kind of makes you Greek. So we're going to get into some of these weeds. It's a lot of interesting history. So let me just get started here. First, I'll talk about cultural comparisons. I'm just going to rush through these notes real quick because I've been told I only have a short window to speak, about an hour, and I want to allow for questions and answers. My wife is here. She can attest that I used to be a Protestant pastor, so I can speak for an hour and 45 minutes. Kind of like the hobbits from Lord of the Rings, where you had second and third breakfast. I can have second and third sermons. So I will go very short for you guys. So cultural comparisons. This is my thesis. What were the causes of Wyoming Greek American cultural cohesion? And here's what I found. This community is now into the 4th and 5th generation, and is incredibly united to their Greek heritage. Is anybody in here Greek? Well, then that's good. I don't have anybody to proof text me. Check me. They're completely cohesive in their identity as Greek people, even to the 4th and 5th generations. I wanted to know why, because I'm Irish. And I come from a 5th generation Irish background and a 3rd generation Scottish background. But I was very proud of my heritage growing up. And I thought, well, how come I don't have the same experience of my Irish ancestry as the Greeks do their ancestry? They have the Greek festival. They still go to the Greek Orthodox Church. My family's not been Irish Catholic for over a generation. I'm disconnected, even though I'm proud to be Irish. I don't have the same connectivity as the Wyoming Greeks do. And I was wondering, why are they any different? And I was a little bit jealous. So that started my research. I also wanted to know, did location have something to do with the Greeks retaining their Greekness? They're in a very small state. If you didn't know, Wyoming has the least populace of any state in the country. And so, there's that, I guess. I don't know. Does it have anything to do with it? Why would these Greek people who come from a Mediterranean climate come all the way to a place that's cold and windy and high elevation? And you can't grow anything. These are farmers for the most part. They're fishermen. What's out here? What brought them out here? Is that something? And did Wyoming's industries affect their cohesion? They came out primarily to work the mines and the railroads. And by the way, the mines were for the most part owned by the railroads at the time. So did that have something to do with it? So these are my questions that launched me into my investigation of the Greek population of Wyoming. Now, the thing tonight says that this is the Cheyenne Greeks. It's not. It's really all of Wyoming, but Cheyenne has a central part to play in every other Greek community in the state. The Greek communities include Hannah, include Hartville, Sunrise, Sheridan, Worland, Rock Springs, Casper, Cameron, and Rawlins. So that's the Anywhere the railroad was is pretty much where they stopped. Former Governor Mike Sullivan, he once said that Wyoming is a small town with unusually long streets. And that's exactly what you find with the Wyoming Greeks. They are connected to Cheyenne regardless of where they are. So I want to find out what all these things are. And were there specific pillars or institutions that balance their cultural cohesion and assimilation? Because they are fiercely proud to be Greek, but they are lovers of their American patriotism. They are very big patriots, starting almost immediately. They really were a bifurcated culture. They were 100% Greek, but they loved being American. There was no division between them. Why? I love being Irish, and sometimes that's all I love. I do like corned beef too, which isn't Irish. Social science, this is my lens. I'm a historian, but I use a social science lens. You might be thinking, wait, isn't history a social science? Sort of. There's a lot of parallels. It's really a humanity. It's really a form of literature that explores the truth of the past. But I used a social science interdisciplinary format to find out what I wanted to know. So in this, I looked at something we call transnationalism. Transnationalism is really that tension between somebody's sending culture, so Greece, and their receiving culture, America, and that interrelationship across the sea between the two lands that the people call home. Those tensions, the relationship back home, the trade back home, those things are something I needed to look at within the Greek community, as well as something called particularism. And if you say these all in a row, it's a tongue twister. It's great. Particularism is that thing that makes you what you are. So when I grew up in an Irish community, the stories that my aunts and uncles would tell, those stories made me connect with my Irish heritage. So whatever's particulars are those things, those elements of community that retain heritage. So for the Greeks, there are things that help them maintain their identity as Greeks despite being assimilated into an American culture. And we're going to get through some of those things which we call institutions. And cosmopolitanism, I can't even talk. Cosmopolitanism is that thing that bridges the gap between where you are and the culture you're being received into. Everything that is American that they assimilated to, or better word we will use tonight is integrated to, because they didn't quite assimilate like you would think. They're more integrated because they retain their Greek identity. They didn't lose it like my Irish ancestors did. My cousins today probably don't know that they're Irish, and they really don't care. As long as they have their video games, they're great. Cosmopolitanism is that step into the receiving culture and experiencing what that receiving culture has to offer. So as you see, the Greek community has a connection home with transnationalism, retains their heritage even while away from home with particularism, and is experiencing the culture of the United States in cosmopolitanism. That's as nerdy as I'm going to get on you. Okay, that's weighty stuff. I don't want to explain it further because I'm not sure I understand either. But there are institutions. These are the pillars that help maintain that cohesion between Greek identity and American identity. One of these is proprietorship, business ownership. Anybody own a business in there? They at some point in their history switched off from working the mines and the railroads, roughly in the 1920s, and they began to strive for independence. This is the culture. The Greek culture is the culture that brings democracy, brings independence. That's embedded into their cultural milieu. And so when they had a chance to leave the mines and to leave the railroads, and of course not everybody did, but when they did, they opened businesses. And they opened businesses like crazy. In Casper alone, I think I heard something like 10% of all the businesses have Greek ancestry. If a business can have ancestry, I don't know. But key to that is what we call the kathenion, the cafe, the Greek coffee shop culture. That is key to understanding everything you need to know about the Greeks. And if you leave anything today, take away that they like coffee, and you should too. Oops, I think I messed that up. All right. Yeah, she's awesome. And I want to thank Susie and Robin. They also helped me with my dissertation studies when I prepared all this. Associations amidst scrutiny. That's another pillar. They found associations to help them assimilate and to help them retain their Greek identity. And those things are very important. There's a group called the HEPA, which is the American Hellenic, American Hellenic something. I'll get there later. It's a group it's a progressive association that formed in the 1920s to challenge the KKK. That's in my notes to come, so I'll just skip by that real quick. Church. They are an ethno-religion. Have you heard of that word, ethno-religion? Okay. What's one group you think of when I say ethno-religion? Swedes and Lutherans. Okay, well, I guess that's true. We tend to associate different Protestant groups with cultures, Lutherans especially in Germany and other Germanic-speaking cultures. But probably the most famous is Judaism. It's an ethno-religion. You take the religion out of the Jew, but you can't take the Jew out of the Jew. In the similar sense, the Greeks operate along those same lines. So we're going to talk about the church and its role in helping retain Greekness in the American backdrop. And the last pillar is the Greek festival, which is a synthesis of culture and community. All those nerdy terms I gave you earlier, transnationalism, particularism, and cosmopolitanism, they all come to play in the Greek festival. Here are some numbers I want you to just be aware of. So now take yourself back to roughly 1890 through the 1920s. These are the numbers. Between 1900 and 1915, one quarter of Greek working age males came to the United States. 1/4. They sent home $5 million annually to support destitute families and villages, as well as to pay into their sisters' dowries. That was pretty key. So the biggest reason they came was money, because that's why we come. We want money. And immigration was sparse prior to 1900. By 1934, 500,000 Greeks, 500,000, immigrated to the United States. And according to a 1906 Census Church report, 93.9% were men, which actually raised some hackles with some nativists, and we'll talk about that too. By 1910, there were roughly 93,447 Greeks in the United States. Only 7,000 or so were women. Not a lot of women. For every 1,100 Greek men, there were about 100 Greek women. And there were less than 2,000 Greeks in Wyoming in 1910. 1.3% of the population in Wyoming is Greek. 7% of the Greek population emigrated to the U.S. between 1890 and 1924. Does anybody know what happened in 1924? What was that? War? No, 1924 was the introduction of the Johnson-Reed Act, which is the Immigration Act. It is an immigration quota act that reduced the amount of immigration from countries to 100 or 2% of what's based on the 1890 census. Now, in 1921, there was an earlier version of this act, basically, and it's kind of the archetype, where 3% of the population on a 1910 census. So if this was a 1910 census, they had about 2,000 Greeks in the area in 2,000. Sorry, I'm messing my brain. 2,000 Greeks in Wyoming in 1910. So that would have been incredibly reduced by the 1890 standards. In the 1910 standards, they would have gained a couple hundred people every year. But when 1890, the Immigration Act formed, they lost their impetus, and almost zero Greeks were allowed to immigrate to the United States, basically 103 Greeks. 60% of all Greeks did return to Greece by 1930. Families didn't take root until the 1920s, and you'll see that there was no real presence of the Greek Orthodox Church until the 1920s, and the first Orthodox Church was in 1922 here in Cheyenne. Still here, by the way. 45,000 Greek men returned to Greece around 1912 to fight for their motherland in the Balkan Wars. And I don't know how many stayed, though you know 45,000 people probably stayed. I don't know how many returned. So why Wyoming? We talked a little bit about the weather. The weather is harsh. I'm not even sure why you guys are here. I'm only here because I grew up in Los Angeles, and that answers my question. It was harsh. There's a frontier perception. Probably the biggest driver outside of the financial reward was that sense of rugged independence that comes with the cowboy culture. People came initially to other parts of the United States, New York, through Ellis Island. They settled in Chicago. There's a sizable Greek population in Chicago. The first Greek settlement in the United States was in New Orleans in 1866. So there are pockets of Greek culture throughout the United States. The question is, why Wyoming? When they arrived into the larger cities, most of the jobs available were it's almost akin to panhandling. They were shoe shiners, they were short order cooks. They didn't make a lot of money. They worked whatever jobs they could get. But when they found out that the mines and the railroad were paid them sizably for even though it's hard work, they rushed into the West. Mostly they settled Colorado and Utah and parts of New Mexico, but Wyoming was also an attractive thing. So they came primarily to make money to send home. They helped save what's called a nucleated village. In Greece, the villages were centered around the church. That's kind of your nucleus. Your parish priest was the father of the community. It was very familiar. And so the whole village is centered around the functions of that church. And every other thing that happens in that village, whether it's farming, and usually it's subsistence farming, so you farm and garden for your own sake, but then you can sell to your neighbors or barter with your neighbors. So everything that happened economically was still centered around the church. So this is a nucleated village, but they started to suffer. Around 1900, there was an insect that began to kill off the grape vineyards in France and Russia, which were the two predominant producers of wine. And they needed to make money, needed to sell wine. That was the big industry. And so Greece came along and said, hey, we got this thing that might be able to help you. It's not a grape, it's a currant. And so this might help you reboost your wine production. You can splice the one to the other, help reboost your production of grapes. And France and Russia said, this is fantastic. We would love to take you up on this offer. So these Greek villages began to burn their primary cash crop, which you might be able to guess is olives. So they burned down their olive orchards. They burned down their other industries and made the land renewed for current production. Unfortunately, they were so good at this that France and Russia recouped their losses and were able to produce their own grapes again because of Greek help. Unfortunately, that meant no business for the Greeks. So the villages began to crumble. People were destitute. And that's what sparked the immigration to the United States. They needed a way to send money home. Most Greeks were what we call sojourners. These are people who come for a spell. They do not intend to stay. They want to go home. They want to come and work. And who's going to come work? The men, the young men. as young as 13, 14 years old, would come here by themselves. They would sometimes find family or people from their village. Oftentimes, their fellow villagers would be recruiters, something we call a padrone, a patron, and they would help find work for these young men coming from Greece. And these young men would work and send money home, primarily to help pay for their sisters' dowries, as well as the subsistence of their family and the health of their village. By 1960, Greek villages had made a complete turnaround because of American Greek remittance home. And that includes the Greeks who decided to stay permanently. That's a function of transnationalism. And that helped Greece, their economy, and it slowed down later immigration. So by having a connection here to home, they were able to slow down their losses. So a quarter of all Greek men came, and they helped save Greece. Pretty wild stuff. So that's why Wyoming. Some interesting stories. They came. Most came for this purpose to send money home, but not everybody. There's one cool story about a guy named Gus Panos. Gus Panos, he came and settled in Hartville, or actually Sunrise, more specifically. Have you ever been to Hartville or Sunrise? And Sunrise, it's pretty much a dead mining town, and neighboring is Hartville. And these two communities actually played off each other. Hartville, that was where the bawdiness was. That's where all the brothels were. It was pretty lively. There's a lot of fights and gangs. It was a pretty rough and tumble crowd. But in Sunrise, everything's manicured. You have trash service. You rent a house there, but you're under the thumb of the iron industry. It was an iron mine. So you're under the thumb of the rail and iron industry in Sunrise. Sunrise, thank you. In Sunrise, it was a mining town, and so you're beholden to their policies. So a lot of the Greeks in the community said, "Well, this is too oppressive. We're going to move over to Hartville." So they played off each other. Some wanted the family life, the quiet life. Others were like, "Well, I have no independence. I have no wife because there's no Greek women here." So they moved to Hartville and partied it up. But they played off each other, and that actually helped preserve a sense of peace with the mining company. Have you ever heard of the Ludlow massacre in Colorado? Yes. Okay. Led by a Greek guy, and they were oppressed in this mining town, this company town. They couldn't function without the mining town telling you what's what. Their kids had to go to the mining town schools, and all the mining town schools are going to do is make new miners out of it. So there's no advancement, there's no future. It was very oppressive. So they started a protest, which turned into a slight rebellion, and Colorado National Guard came in as essentially strike breakers and protest enders, and massacred several of the immigrants there, most of which were Greek, including I think it was a 6-month-old little girl. So it was a terrible time. But that tension did not exist in the mining towns in Wyoming because they were able to balance out that bawdiness, that rough and tumble crowd, and the mining town rules, and they played off each other like a foil. It was a pretty neat thing. But there were people who came to work in the mines who did not have any transnational obligations, and they just wanted to make money and live. One of those was a guy named Gus Panos. Gus Panos, like a lot of people in the age, liked to drink. And he and his buddies were out there shooting one day, and he's shooting out in the field. This is, I think, in around 1910. And bullet ricocheted. We don't know whose bullet, but it's one of his friends or his. A bullet ricocheted, went through the window of a nearby house, which also was a restaurant, and he killed an Italian fellow that was his actual best friend. And so Gus Panos was cornered. He was the only one arrested, and he pled guilty by pressure, even though there's no certitude as to who actually killed this Italian guy. So Gus Panos went to jail. And while in jail, he made appeal. His lawyers made appeal, and they talked to the prosecutor, this guy named W.B. Ross. I don't know if that's familiar. He was the 12th governor of Wyoming, but before he was governor, he was a prosecutor in Laramie County. Hartville and Sunrise were still part of Laramie County at that point. They had not become Platte County yet. And so they were still centered to Cheyenne. So Gus came down to Cheyenne, went to trial, was sentenced to 10 to 15 years in Rawlins. He appealed, and W.B. Ross, William Ross, the 12th governor prior to his governorship, he petitioned Francis Warren, who was the then governor, and Francis Warren did eventually pardon Gus, and he was able to live, and he lived in Rawlins the rest of his years, and he died as a railroader. But he had that he didn't come for that transnational sending money home. He came to make it rich. His parents were dead. His brother was already here. His brother lived in Rock Springs. This was his life. So it wasn't an easy life for some of these Greeks. They had it pretty rough. But around 1920s, they began to bring women home, especially as they went off to the Balkans to fight. They then went to Greece, brought their wives home here to the United States, those who wanted to stay. They start building families. And what do you need as a linchpin to your community? You need the church. So that's when you start to see the rise of the churches. People are empowered. They're starting to make money. They're opening businesses. And that launches the Greeks into the next level. No more working for the man. They're working for themselves. Greeks were very industrious. They're very, very proud people. They wanted to make a name for themselves, and working for the man was not in the cards. Like I said, there was something called a padrone, which was a patron that recruited Greeks. There's a Leon Skleris, who was a Greek in Salt Lake City, who recruited a lot of people for Wyoming and Utah. And a lot of the Greeks that settled, especially in Kemmerer, Rock Springs, Green River, and Rawlins, were settling there because of this guy Skleris. But he also he skimmed off the top, and so he had this thumb on those Greeks. And so when it was time to get out from under that system, that oppressive system, they did, and they opened businesses. And these are some interesting pictures. This is a grocer here in Cheyenne, a Greek grocery store. That is a Greek cafe, the cafe or restaurant. This one here is over in Rawlins. This is a candy shop, the Acropolis Candy Shop in Rock Springs or Green River, I can't remember which. And this is a famous story. If you ever go to LCCC, in the business building, it talks about Barbara and Anthony Andrikopoulos. And they started an oil company. So very successful people in the business world. One of my favorites is a guy named Harry Mavrakis. He lived in Sheridan. Interesting enough, his granddaughter lives here in Cheyenne. But Mavrakis lived in Sheridan, and he was injured while working the mines, and he decided that he wanted to go into business for himself, but didn't know how to get it started. The mining company bought him, or not bought him, but made him manager of a mining-owned pool hall. And then he later opened his own. Sadly, it burned down a few months after opening. So he rebuilt, and sadly, that one burned down too. So then he rebuilt. Sadly, that one was a little more interesting. That one didn't burn down, but there was a fire. And then a competing pool hall down the road was burned next week by somebody else. And they found the gas can out in front of the pool hall. And the gas can was traced to a guy whose brother just happened to be the security guard for Harry Mavrakis' pool hall. See where I'm going with this? So they rebuilt. They were very successful. And eventually they were busted by the law because they They were gamblers. They had the pool hall in the back and a cafe and a coffee shop and diner up front. So Sheridan has really severe anti-gambling laws, so you couldn't gamble much there. But you can have the coffee shop in front, and you're less scrutinized in the back because you're in the coffee shop up front. In the back's where all the fun happens, and people that like to play cards and gamble and drink booze and they get in fights and all that rowdy stuff. And it was pretty passive that the local sheriff would come by and give them a fine every month of about $100, $104. Here's your fine, and they pay it like it was a tax, like it was dues. And so it's like, oh yeah, we'll pay that money. So they would actually walk over to the courthouse and pay their fine every month as a business expense. Until the 1960s, when a young lawyer came into town and said, we're going to crush this thing, no more gambling, shut them down. The sheriff came and confiscated all their gaming tables, took them to the lawn of the courthouse in Sheridan and burned them. So at the beck and call of Mavrakis' sons, including a guy named Sam Mavrakis, they transitioned their business into a sporting goods store. Incidentally, there's a gentleman in Rock Springs back in the early 20th century who started perhaps the very first sporting goods store in the United States out of Rock Springs. So the second one would be this they call it the Ritz Sporting Goods Store in Sheridan. Ritz was also the name of the former pool hall, and it was supposedly named after a brothel in Thermopolis. We're not sure about that.
Before you go on,
Yeah.
Where was the grocery store in China?
I'm not sure. The person, I got this from one of the parish priests, and he didn't know. But we're pretty certain this is the Albany, for the diner there. So that's as much as I know. I'm not exactly certain.
Could be the Bluebird.
Sorry?
Bluebird.
Could be the Bluebird. They were all related. In fact, the Bluebird was a spin-off of the Albany as well as the Athens Candy Company. And today, the spin-off, we know it as Uncle Charlie's. All connected. So at any rate, the gambling was over. They opened a sporting goods store. And by the end of the 1960s, they became the number one sporting goods store in Wyoming. And they won awards nationally for their sporting goods store. Sam Mavrakis became a very famous fly fisherman and fly rod builder. He built fly rods and took people out on fly fishing trips, including Dick Cheney, Pam Dauber from Mork and Mindy. That's pretty good, pretty cool. And the Queen of England and the Prince of Wales. Very famous guy. And when his father, Harry Mavrakis, who he acknowledged was a racketeer, passed away, Sam and his brother took over the business. And sadly, in the 1980s, it burned down. I don't know what's going on here, but it burned down again. And, eventually it closed by the late 80s, early 90s. And Sam Mavrakis went on to win awards. Even though he had a criminal background, he worked as a game warden, oddly. And in his honor as an outdoorsman, the city of Sheridan started a fishing pond in the late 80s, early 90s called the Sam Mavrakis Fishing Pond, which is incidentally governed by his great nephew today. Really interesting stuff. So a lot of great foundation. Now, Sam's Sam's niece is a lady named Faye Zaharis. She married a guy named George Zaharis, whose family immigrated in the early 20th century, but his grandfather and his uncle Peter came, but his grandfather said, I don't want to be here because this is about prohibition time. Says if they're going to ban alcohol, I'm out of here. So he went back to Greece. And then he had another son. That son had this guy named George. George immigrated in the 1950s when it was starting to open up for immigration again after the 1924 Immigration Act. So he married Faye Zaharis, who's from Sheridan. They all connected down here. They're still together today. Great people. Interesting story. And of course, George became a proprietor too. So being a business owner was a big part of retaining your Greek identity. What's most important about this is something called the cafe, the coffee shop. Coffee shop culture dates back to Plato. Plato wrote a book called the Symposium. Symposiums were these times when men can get together and be men. I don't know what that means. You probably fill in the blanks, because men had a different context there. But they had dancing girls. They drank. They drank. They got drunk. They partied. They read each other poems, and they talked about their sex lives. It was a weird club. That symposium, that drinking and having social activities, kind of like an Irish pub, it morphed and evolved into coffee shop culture. And the Greeks adopted the coffee, the Greek style or the Turkish style of coffee under the Ottoman Empire. So Greek coffee is really Turkish coffee. I don't know how that works, but it's all related. And the whole Mediterranean is full of this vibrant coffee shop style pub life. And so that was very important here in the United States. It was a place where the men can come. And of course, these coffee shops were open to everybody. And it was kind of like the information hub for the community. People would come in, they'd find jobs just by coming to the coffee shop and talking. They learn news of their homeland. So there's that transnational background. But they're retaining their Greek culture. They're speaking Greek here. That helped keep that particularism going. But they're open to everybody who wants to come in. So they're very cosmopolitan as well. The coffee shop was that perfect bridge between the two cultures, the United States and the Greek identity. The coffee shops evolved in time into regular restaurants, and by today's standards, they have lost their entire Greek identity. So the businesses nowadays are just businesses, but back in the day, they help maintain your Greek identity. The next thing, integration by association. This is the KKK creed. This actual image is found in the Henry Ford Museum. If you didn't know, Henry Ford was kind of bigoted. So this was really up his alley. And this was, you can't read it, but the KKK, this is the second iteration of the KKK. They started around 1920. And by 1924, they had pushed in that Johnson-Reed Immigration Act. I'm sorry, not Johnson-Reed. Yeah, Johnson-Reed. I was thinking hard to sell. Johnson-Reed Immigration Act. But in that era, the Atlanta, Georgia Greek population was being targeted by the KKK. So they formed something called the HEPA, which is the American Hellenic, I can't remember the E off the top of my head, Progressive Association. Their whole purpose was to help the Greeks transition and become more American. Because if you're more American, you're not scrutinized by these dudes. So they want to become more Americanized. And it was working. And English was their official business language at their HEPA meetings. There was another association that spoke only Greek. They died out because they only spoke Greek. But this worked. They helped build churches to help maintain your Greek identity, but they helped transition into culture so these guys are less scrutinizing. Interestingly enough, the KKK at that time really weren't targeting a lot of your typical ethnic backgrounds. They were targeting immigrants and Roman Catholics. So if you're Irish, man, you're going to have a bad day with these guys around. There was KKK here in Wyoming. Casper was kind of the big epicenter for the KKK. There were some here in Cheyenne. They mostly targeted Roman Catholics and Black community. There were some in Rock Springs. They died out. They targeted a mosque. If you don't know about Rock Springs was very multicultural. Since the 1920s, they've had an event called International Day, where every culture, and there are 56, 57 different cultures that make up the population of Rock Springs. This is a picture from the Greek community when it first started. And that culture intermingled with everybody else. They call it the Heinz 57 of cities. By the 1950s, it was considered one of the most integrated cities in the United States. So Wyoming never really had that same degree of hate, that the KKK brought elsewhere. It was very much that equality state, even when it wasn't very equal. Comes along, there's a a woman named Hebert. You heard that name? Grace Hebert. Grace Raymond Hebert. She led the Americanization project here in Wyoming to help the ethnic minorities develop more Americanized standards and language skills, and she helped them find citizenship. But by the late 1920s, she kind of abandoned that mission and became pretty nationalist. She became on par with a guy named Henry Pratt Fairfield, or Fair, I think it's Fairchild. And there's, have you heard of Grant Madison or Madison Grant? Madison Grant. Madison Grant was a eugenicist. Fairchild was the president of the population. Oh gosh, what is it called? It was an anti-population growth society that was co-chaired by Margaret Sanger, who helped start Planned Parenthood. So you have these eugenicists, you have these anti-population growth people, and Hebert became part of that kind of crew by the 1920s. So, but she started out helping Greeks become part of the culture. And they did. And they did it on their own terms. Hebert's Americanization program did not quite make it to the Greek communities, which were mostly in mining towns and too far and few between. So they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, learned English, adopted Americanisms. They even adopted American names. They changed their names, like Herlaftis to the last name of Moores, which they pronounced Morris because they thought it was an Irish name. They wanted to be an Irish group. So they said, I want to be Morris, even though they spelled it Moores. They pronounced it Morris. That was an interesting story. Gus Morris was a guy, he lived here in Cheyenne. He once was accosted by the KKK that were here, and he dehooded the Grand Wizard of the KKK, and it turned out to be the governor. Now that's a family legend. I have not found anything to substantiate that, but who knows? Who knows? But there were some pushback, but it wasn't great. But just in case, they became part of a HEPA to learn how to be more American, to lose the scrutiny that the KKK brought. And they also joined what's called 100% American groups. These were groups that started in World War II, anti-German groups that were focused on pride. They helped sponsor bond sales, war bond sales. And the Greeks became some of the best sellers of war bonds in Wyoming. They were so proud they even beat out Denver for the amount of war bonds they sold. So yeah, they integrated into the culture by association, but groups like a HEPA helped them retain their heritage. Today, a HEPA is nothing. A HEPA is mostly a shell. In fact, you don't have to be Greek to join it, and it's just another fraternal organization. Still, you'll find it at the Greek churches. There are members, but it's more of an honorary, sentimental kind of thing. So that's pretty much dead. Business ownership is no longer important to retaining culture. But what is important is the church. Incarnationality is a word. I don't know if I coined it. If I did, I'll take credit for it. Incarnationality is a theological principle of everything that is happening within the visual and oral and everything in the church. Everything you can see, hear, and taste, smell, and touch is incarnate with theological truth. Incidentally, these are some really cool churches. This is the Greek church in Rock Springs, and so is this. But notice this has an onion dome. What kind of Orthodox have onion domes? Russians. This was a Russian Orthodox church. They ran out of money, sold it to the Greeks. Oops. So the Greeks got rid of the onion dome, but they kept the church. But they all still met in the same church because it was the same people. Even though the Russians owned it, to be Greek Orthodox is just Orthodox. It's not a cultural thing. You can be Russian Orthodox, go to a Greek Orthodox church. You can be Serbian Orthodox, go to a Greek Orthodox church, vice versa, because Orthodoxy is orthodoxy. The cultural dynamic, the cultural moniker or tagline that we apply is really where the patriarch is for that section. They're semi-autonomous, but they're all in one communion. So that's the church. This is the Pantocrator. This is a kind of an inside dome. where Jesus is peering down from heaven. If you ever go to Washington, D.C., go to the Capitol building. If you ever go to the Capitol building, you see inside the dome of the Capitol building is George Washington peering down, not Jesus, because we have a cultural religious dynamic in the United States, which is politicized. And you'll see him flanked by two pagan goddesses, Victory and Liberty. And they call that the apotheosis of Washington, or the becoming God of Washington. So it really is a ripoff of the Greeks. Well, that's what this is. This is the inside dome of St. Constantine and Helen Church here in Wyoming, Cheyenne. This is the church. You'll see there's no outside dome, but there's an inside dome. As George Harris, who is an attender of that church, he says it's a fake dome. They all call it a fake dome, but that's because they couldn't build the real dome. They ran out of money. This was supposed to be modeled off of a church called the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, in Constantinople. And there they have a major dome. And when the Ottomans came through, they took it over and they turned it into a mosque. Now it's a museum, and the Orthodox would really like it back. So if you have any, sway, there you go. So they couldn't build the outside dome, so they built the fake dome. So that's the church. And then there's an Episcopal church in Hartville. So that Episcopal church is important because when the first generations of Greeks came, they didn't have their churches. They didn't have women. And where are they going to worship? And some small towns never had churches. Where are they going to worship? Well, they had to find a proxy. They had to find an approximate stand-in. And the Episcopal church was pretty close. And the Episcopal church almost came into communion with the Orthodox church back in the 1920s. It broke down over certain theological issues. I won't get into that because we don't have time. I'm probably going pretty close to over anyway. This is a picture of a gentleman named Athenagoras. He was the bishop of North and South America. This is in 1936. Athenagoras was, he oversaw all the churches in the Western Hemisphere. And he came to consecrate this church, St. Constantine and Helen, right over on 27th Street here. He came to consecrate the church. He stood in front of the church. He looked back because you could see at that time, you could see the Capitol building right behind him. And he says, see that building? That building is the capital of the people of Wyoming. You are the capital of the Greeks of Wyoming. So that one long street really makes sense now because all the Greek churches are connected to this one mother church. And usually that's what we call a cathedral. This is not a cathedral, but there's a unison there. That's why the Cheyenne Greeks have the Greek festival. It's the biggest Greek attended event. It's the second biggest attended event in Cheyenne every year anyway, after some weird little thing called Frontier Days. So very important stuff. This guy, Athenagoras, he went on to become the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, basically the number one guy in Orthodoxy a few years later. So pretty nice knowing he came to town. So that is the purpose of the church. Now, when I say incarnationality, the belief of the Orthodox is that images and sensory things are important because they help draw you to a higher reality. I brought with myself an icon of St. Patrick. I'm Irish. I'm going to have St. Patrick. This is just wood. Now, in some Protestant circles, they say, well, that's idol worship, unless you put your own images on the screen for some reason. But the Greeks don't worship this. It's just wood. It's just a picture. But this is what they call an archetype. This is a way to point you to something beyond yourself, a reality. This guy, St. Patrick, really lived at one point, and then he died. Where is he now? So to the Greeks, he's still around. He's in heaven. So he's incarnate within a higher reality. So this piece of wood is incarnate with a certain presence. It's not anything but wood, but it is a window to heaven. The church is a window to heaven. You have the Virgin Mary, the Theotokos. You have Christ. You have all these images of saints and different events. These are all ways to point to heaven. They look at the church as a conduit, as a representation of heaven on earth. And it was modeled after the tabernacle and the temple in ancient Israel. In fact, the design is very similar. It's just very ornate because they want the visual experience, because they believe it is a connection point. When you go to church, you are enlivening heaven on earth. So that's incarnate. In the same way, to have the Greek Byzantine architecture in your church also was a way to bring heaven, not just heaven to earth, but also your culture to your new land. This was like an embassy or a consulate. It was a way to come into a foreign land and bridge that gap. And the Greek community, the Greek government in the early 20th century welcomed the migration out and thought that this is a new form of being Greek. And it's connected with the new flavors and the growth of that Greek church wherever it lands. So in some real sense, this was an incarnate form of the motherland. So when you go to a Greek Orthodox church, it is an incarnation of Greekness as well as a conduit to heaven. And so there's theological depth there. Have you ever heard of something called the boat of Theseus? Theseus was a Greek god, and he had a ship, and the ship's on in a museum. Over time, the ship broke down, and all the wood would rot. And they replaced it with new wood, new flanges, new whatever. Until one day, that original material was all gone. This is Hagia Sophia, this new material. But in some reality, some transspatial way, this is Greece. This is Turkey, but at the time it was a very recognized place. So this is part of your ancestry. It is a consulate. It is a way to bridge the gap between lands. So incarnationality was something very important. George de Harris, who Faith de Harris was his wife, descendant of Harry Mavrakis, the racketeer of Sheridan. George's family maintained a transnational relationship until he came over. When he was over in Greece, before coming in the 1950s, his mother used to have a picture of his uncle cut out and then transposed onto another picture of the whole family. So it's like having their uncle with them when you look at the picture. And it was really well done. I saw it at his house. It's a very well done picture, and it looks like it's natural. And they had guys who would actually make these photos to connect the two. And so that was kind of that transnational connection there. Even though his uncle was still in the United States, he felt like he always knew him. And that was very common in Greek communities. So the sense of connecting far and distant lands is what helped keep the Greeks Greek. They would speak the language in the church, though it's not spoken as much anymore, mostly in a few hymns. It's an English service, but there's still Greek culture. And that culture is best expressed in its other pillar, the festival. And dancing, music. Have you ever heard the saying, the best way to know a culture is through their food? It's very true. They enliven that culture by practicing it, what we call mimicry. These people have probably never grown up in an actual Greek context, but only the Greek American context. But when they dance, and when you have the food, and when you have the faith, you bring a little bit of that reality because of that incarnationality. And so that's why I can say I'm not Greek, but I am sort of, because I live it with these people. It's a neat cultural dynamic. So they were able to maintain their identity at the same time. They were able to become fully American and immerse themselves in our lives. So that is the Greeks of Wyoming. Any questions before I go? I know I ramble. I'm sorry.
What area code is 661?
Well, that's a totally relevant question. 661 is actually California.
Okay, thank you.
I grew up in Los Angeles. Yes, sir.
I attended a Germans from Russia convention just 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
One of the speakers was, I'll call him an ethnologist with a background from Wheaton College.
Okay.
He spoke that the national identity, a cultural identity, is usually lost in America after his third generation. He said it takes 3 generations, and he went through examples, one after another, to where the kids really do want to play on their Nintendo.
Yeah, right.
And the parents want to go to the German Russian club.
Exactly.
So
No, that's exactly.
that out.
That's why I thought this was so unique. The culture here is still very Greek, even unto the 5th generation. And I know mine wasn't like that. Incidentally, do you remember his name?
No, but the Historical Society of Germans from Russia is in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Yes.
And all of the presentations are going to be online by start of the year.
Well, I went to Chadron State College, and I had a professor there kind of turned me on to this transnationalism. And he wrote a book. His doctoral dissertation became a book, and it included, because he went to the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and included the German Russians. So his name is Dr. Kurt Kinbach.
I have notes from that in a program, and I can look it up.
Okay.
It's back in Kentucky.
Really, and that actually helped launch some of my ideas. Yes, sir.
If you studied the Greeks in Cheyenne, as I remember, they were involved with the restaurant business, the bar business,
Yeah.
primarily.
And they sometimes that's all it was. The restaurant, the bar, pool hall, dance hall, it was all one thing.
Valencia, the Mayflower,
Yeah.
the Bluebird.
Andrew.
Yeah. And in fact,
Yeah, but also
some of the general store, they also function as the mortuaries in town, in certain towns here in Wyoming. You buy your coffin at your local shop, shop it for your dinner, and then you say, hey, here's a coffin. Yeah, it's about time. Yeah, you're right. The restaurant business, that cafe, the coffee shop culture, that symposium is very, very important to the Greeks. And so that's kind of why they got in the hospitality industry to begin with, is because it met those requirements.
Patrick, in all of your research, is there any one thing that just totally surprised you?
It's really interesting. When I did my dissertation defense, I was challenged by one of my professors that, because I mentioned that my Irish ancestry, I did not have the same connectivity as the Greek parody generation. And she said, well, what about those in Boston and New York? They might have a greater sense of being Irish. And I said, yeah, that's probably right. Out west, I think people lost that identity and built whole new systems. But the Greeks, I think that's what surprised me about the Greeks, is they didn't build a whole new system. They challenged that and retained what they saw as integral to their being Greek. They could not disconnect being Greek with those pillars that I mentioned. Most of those pillars have kind of faltered except for the church. The church is really that number one pillar that helped them retain themselves. And so I was surprised that they could have easily lost it all, especially when it's just men that came at first. They could have intermarried with non-Greeks, some did, but they could have intermarried and they could have lost all that connectivity and never went back to Greece, never had relationships home. Once they sent their last dollar to their sisters' dowries, they could have stayed and ditched out on all that and made big bucks. They did. They retained their community and liked them. And everything they did was incarnational, like I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
A friend asked me to ask you about, did you find any Greeks in Thermopolis?
I did not do any research in Thermopolis.
You mentioned Worland earlier.
I did, yeah. Worland. There was one of the guy named John Brown Argyris started a restaurant there in Worland, and then also up in Tennessee.
You
Yeah.
said there was a restaurant in Manhattan.
Okay. Yeah. So he did some good things, and so he drew from some of those areas' influences. I don't know what Greek population existed in Thermopolis. definitely a Greek name, so I don't know. But I probably could have found other pockets of Greek identity, but I did explore the main ones where you have primary source work that pointed me in that direction. Any other questions?
Yes, another question. Does anyone know the family that owned the South Side Bar? If you remember the South Side Bar, you come down off of the Viaduct over the railroad at the corner of 9th and Central Avenue.
Zaharis.
It's there. It's George Zaharis belongs.
George Zaharis.
So right next door. Yeah.
He also had the Town and Country Pharmacy.
Yeah, he was a pharmacist there, and he owns the shopping center off of South Greeley where there's a Domino's. He owns a shopping center. So yeah, there's some of those businesses are still Greek owned, though they've lost some of the.
Well, next to the bar was a grocery store,
Okay.
also owned by the family.
Yeah.
My grandparents lived at 10th Street, 103 East 10th, and they used to walk over to the grocery, and my granddad would go to the bar.
And the bar was purchased by George Zaharis' father from another Greek, two Greek partners in business. I can't remember their name, but they didn't buy the grocery store, but they bought the bar.
They bought the bar.
So the Zaharis is still in the bar.
The Ketch's family are part of it.
Yeah, I think so. You're absolutely right. Yes.
So were there any records that or stories that you had hoped to find that you didn't find that you're still kind of looking for?
You know, I really wanted to find something more robust in some of the smaller towns. I researched the libraries, the museums. I could not find a whole lot for some areas. But even Laramie, which is right nearby, I knew there was a Greek population there, but I could not uncover enough material. Even at the University of Wyoming, when I did my research, I couldn't find anything. There's a lot of history that's gone under the radar and has disappeared because nobody saved it. And this is kind of the downside to losing your culture. Some of those outlying areas like Hannah, like Rawlins, they lost their Greek identity because people move on. Sheridan used to have a Greek Orthodox church. It's closed down. There are still Greeks up there, but they don't have the same cohesion as you have in Cheyenne. So they're kind of typical of losing your culture because they're they're removed from the churches. So Cheyenne's lucky. You have two Greek Orthodox churches in Cheyenne. There's one in Casper, there's one in Rock Springs, and there's a small chapel in Worland that's governed by the church in Casper. But the Worland community is losing its identity. Rock Springs is losing its identity. They're mostly itinerant preachers, so they're not open all the time. Cheyenne might just be, and Casper might be the last bastions of Greek identity. But they're not dying. That's the neat thing.